pitch doesn't change. Your vocabulary doesn't change. Your argument doesn't change. What changes is the sound underneath all of it, the register, the pace, the muscular quality of the air leaving your lungs. And you don't notice it happening because it completes before your conscious attention can reach it. You walk into a room containing someone whose position in the hierarchy exceeds yours, and something in your vocal apparatus adjusts itself automatically in the first 2 to 4 seconds of contact without a single conscious instruction from you. This is not a social habit. It is not a learned behavior in any conventional sense. It is a biological output, and understanding what is actually producing it, the specific neural circuit that fires, the evolutionary logic it is running, the chemical environment it creates, is the difference between a man who spends his career unconsciously signaling subordination to people he is supposed to be meeting as an equal, and a man who understands precisely what his nervous system is doing and why. Most men, if they notice the vocal shift at all, attribute it to nerves. That attribution is close enough to feel accurate and wrong enough to be useless. Nerves is a colloquial name for a physiological state with a precise mechanism, and that mechanism is the thing worth examining. Because the voice change is not the problem. It is the symptom. The problem is an ancient, involuntary hierarchy detection circuit that has been misidentified by the conscious mind as a social experience, when it is, in fact, a neurological one. The periaqueductal gray is a small structure in the midbrain, approximately 14 millimeters in diameter, that has existed in vertebrates for roughly 400 million years. It has one primary function: threat and status response coordination. When your nervous system reads an incoming stimulus as hierarchically superior, not dangerous in the predator sense, but dominant in the social hierarchy sense, the periaqueductal gray fires, and that firing initiates a cascade that includes direct modulation of the laryngeal muscles responsible for pitch and resonance. The vocal shift is not anxiety bleeding into your voice. It is a specifically targeted motor output from a status detection circuit that has been running since before mammals existed. The signal that triggers this cascade is not what you think it is. It is not the other person's words. It is not their argument or their title or even their direct behavior toward you. The periaqueductal gray is not reading language. It is reading a constellation of somatic signals processed below conscious cognition, faster than any verbal content could be interpreted. Posture, movement economy, eye contact pattern, the speed at which they occupy space, the quality of their silence. These inputs are evaluated in parallel by the amygdala and relayed to the periaqueductal gray in a time frame measured in milliseconds, long before the prefrontal cortex has organized anything approaching a conscious assessment. By the time you form the thought, "This is an important person," the motor adjustment to your laryngeal muscles has already been issued. The thought doesn't cause the response. The thought arrives after the response has already been executed and is then assembled, usually incorrectly, as an explanation of what just happened. This sequence matters because it exposes the structural futility of the most common strategy men use to manage this problem. The standard approach is cognitive. You tell yourself the right things before a high-stakes interaction. You remind yourself of your preparation, your track record, your legitimate standing in the room. Some men rehearse affirmations. Some visualize successful outcomes. Some conduct explicit self-assessments of their value relative to the person they're about to meet. All of these interventions operate at the level of the prefrontal cortex, conscious cognition, deliberate thought, the newest and most evolutionarily recent layer of the brain. The periaqueductal gray is not listening to the prefrontal cortex. The subcortical hierarchy circuit does not process propositional content. It cannot be argued with, reasoned with, or updated through conscious evaluation. It processes somatic signals, the state of your own nervous system, read as an input alongside every other signal in the environment, which means the most reliable predictor of whether the circuit fires a subordination response in a given interaction is not what you believe about yourself going in.
Reflecting the most salient
it is
spoken
the
words
state of your
occurring during the
autonomic
8-second
nervous
video,
system
using
in
the
the
specified
moment of
speaker
initial
symbols,
contact.
or
And the autonomic nervous system responds to what it perceives, not to what you prefer it to perceive. Here is the mechanism in full. The firing of the periaqueductal gray triggers a downstream release of cortisol and adrenaline, which activates the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Fight, flight, or in hierarchical contexts, something more specific than either. Stephen Porges' polyvagal framework describes a third state, distinct from fight-flight, a ventral vagal withdrawal that produces passive, appeasement-oriented behavior. Softened voice, decreased eye contact duration, reduced postural authority, verbal hedging. This is not the same as fear. It does not feel like fear from the inside. It feels like appropriate deference, reasonable caution, legitimate humility. The body is performing subordination, and the conscious mind, searching for an explanation of the sensory data, generates a narrative in which the behavior is chosen rather than triggered. The cortisol release compounds the problem through a second mechanism. Elevated cortisol suppresses testosterone, and testosterone is the primary biological substrate of what the social literature calls dominant behavior, direct gaze, grounded posture, full vocal resonance, the specific quality of presence that the periaqueductal gray reads as high status in others. The hormonal cascade produced by a subordination trigger actively degrades the physiological signals that would otherwise broadcast equal or superior status. The circuit fires. The hormonal environment shifts. The body produces the signals of the conclusion the circuit had already reached, and the other person's periaqueductal gray, running the same ancient detection system, receives those signals and makes its own assessment in the same millisecond window before any verbal exchange has occurred. Status in the domain the nervous system is actually operating in is not primarily semantic. It is somatic. It is a set of physiological signals broadcast involuntarily, read by equally involuntary detection systems, and processed through a circuit that predates human language by several 100 million years. The meeting, the pitch, the negotiation, these are happening simultaneously at two levels that have almost nothing to do with each other. At the verbal level, two people are exchanging content. At the subcortical level, two nervous systems are running a status calibration that will determine the actual weight assigned to everything being said, and that calibration completed before either person opened their mouth. This is what Robert Sapolsky's research on primate hierarchy makes visible with uncomfortable precision. Across decades of studying status dynamics in baboon troops, Sapolsky found that the most reliable predictor of an individual's dominance position was not physical size, not demonstrated aggression, not track record in direct contests. It was glucocorticoid levels, specifically the baseline cortisol environment the animal carried into every social interaction. The animals that held stable high status were not more aggressive. They were more physiologically settled. Their stress response systems were calibrated in a way that did not trigger subordination cascades in the presence of others. They approached every interaction from a hormonal baseline that their own nervous systems read as secure, and that baseline was, in turn, read by every other nervous system in the environment. The translation to human context is not metaphorical. It is direct. The man who walks into a high-stakes room with a chronically elevated cortisol baseline, produced by months or years of accumulated stress, social threat sensitivity, unresolved status anxiety, is not primarily disadvantaged by what he does in the room. He is disadvantaged by what his nervous system broadcasts before he does anything. The periaqueductal gray circuit in every other person in that room is reading his autonomic state through the same somatic signals he is reading in them. The voice that softens, the gaze that breaks a half-second early, the slight postural contraction that occurs in the first seconds of contact. These are not choices. They are outputs of a physiological state set long before the room was entered, and the room reads them with a precision that no amount of verbal competence compensates for. What compounds this is the recursive quality of the hormonal mechanism. Cortisol suppresses testosterone. Low testosterone reduces the physiological signals of high status. Reduced status signals trigger subordination responses in social contexts, which produces more cortisol. The cascade feeds itself. The man who enters a room already cortisol elevated tends to leave it with his cortisol elevated further because the subordination response he generated and the social reception it produced registers as a status threat that the circuit adds to the load. Over time, repeated exposure to high-status individuals without the physiological capacity to hold ground in those interactions doesn't just produce bad outcomes in the specific interactions. It recalibrates the baseline. The nervous system updates its prior. The default state becomes one in which the presence of hierarchically superior individuals reliably produces this cascade faster and more fully than it did before, because the circuit has been trained by repeated activation. This is the mechanism that explains what most men attribute to imposter syndrome, to confidence deficits, to social anxiety around high performers. It is not a belief problem. It is a physiological calibration problem. The belief is produced by the physiology, not the other way around. A man whose circuit is reliably firing subordination cascades in the presence of high-status individuals will construct beliefs about himself consistent with the somatic experience that cascade produces. The beliefs feel like accurate self-assessment. They are downstream outputs of a neurobiological circuit that cannot distinguish between a genuine hierarchical threat and a meeting with someone who has a more impressive title. The strategic implication is not the one most men reach for. The instinct is to work on the visible outputs, the voice, the posture, the eye contact. This is the same structural error as treating the vocal shift as a confidence problem rather than a neurological one. The outputs are not causes. They are effects, training yourself to maintain fuller vocal resonance in high-stakes interactions without addressing the autonomic state. Producing the constriction is the behavioral equivalent of adjusting the sound on a malfunctioning instrument without touching the fault in the mechanism. It works intermittently under low cognitive load and fails precisely when the stakes are highest, because high-stakes conditions are the conditions under which sympathetic nervous system activation is strongest, and the circuit has the most reliable access to the motor outputs you are attempting to consciously override. The interventions that produce structural change operate at the level where the cascade originates, not cognition, autonomic regulation, the capacity of the ventral vagal system to maintain a parasympathetic baseline under conditions of perceived social threat, which is not a philosophical disposition, but a trainable physiological state produced through specific, documented mechanisms that researchers including Porges and Martin Paulus have mapped with increasing precision. Cardiovascular coherence practices, progressive exposure to high-status social environments without behavioral suppression, and the specific quality of physical exertion that drives testosterone while suppressing chronic cortisol load. These are not confidence-building strategies in any pop psychology sense. They are calibrations to the neurochemical environment in which the periaqueductal gray operates. They change the prior the circuit is running from, and a different prior produces a different cascade threshold. The man who has recalibrated that threshold doesn't walk into a room and consciously manage his voice. He walks in with an autonomic baseline that the circuit reads as secure, and the somatic signals his body broadcasts from that baseline are received by every other periaqueductal gray in the room as what they are: the signature of a nervous system that is not running a subordination response. The voice doesn't soften because there is nothing in the physiological state that requires it to. The gaze holds because the circuit that would break it has not fired. What you are reading in the man who commands a room is not confidence as a personality trait. It is a specific glucocorticoid profile, a specific autonomic state, a ventral vagal baseline stable enough that the circuit processes hierarchically superior individuals without initiating the cascade that produces every visible behavior you have been trying to replicate at the surface level. The question that sits underneath all of this, the one worth remaining with, is not whether the circuit can be recalibrated. It is how much of your career, your professional relationships, your positioning in rooms where your actual capability was never in question, has been decided not by what you knew or what you said, but by what a 14-millimeter midbrain structure was broadcasting about you before you had the chance to speak.